My name's Brooke Mann. I'm a lecturer in the psychology department.
My name is Lockwood. I'm a second-year graduate student in the clinical psychology program.
And we're going to be discussing the stigma of mental illness today. So when putting together this presentation, we thought about what kinds of questions should you be prepared to answer after this presentation. Don't worry, there's no quiz or anything at the end. But by the end, hopefully you'll be able to answer what is stigma of mental illness, why is it important, and how does it impact the individuals who experience that prejudice or discrimination. We're going to talk a little bit about how it has developed and why it persists in today's society. And most importantly, we're going to discuss what you can do as individuals, what we can do as a society, how we can impact the system in terms of decreasing the stigma of mental illness. We intend for this presentation to be interactive, so hopefully you guys will have questions throughout it, and as you have questions, raise your hand and we can have a discussion, but there will also be some time at the end for questions as well.
So in late spring of 2018, the New York Times published an opinion piece article that was actually in response to another article about mental illness titled "The Ways We Fail Those with Mental Illness." And although the article is only a couple pages long, some of the implications and some of the information that is in it has a really impacting impression and has some really important points that we thought was important to bring here to this Times talk. One of the most powerful quotes from it is kind of the last paragraph of the topic, but as you can read here, it talks about being outraged by the way we treat people with a mental illness. But the quote that we thought stood out the most was actually the final line here: "We stigmatize, we underfund, we wring our hands, we do nothing, our cruelty knows no bounds." And that's kind of what we see when we're talking about mental illness and the stigma surrounding it. Before we talk about how we can end stigma and how we can make a difference, we kind of need to know what stigma of mental illness is. So when we're thinking about mental illness stigma, that's just the way that we prejudice or stereotype individuals that have a mental illness. A lot of times stigma is talked about as a negative mark or attribute attached to someone that has a diagnosis. So in this case, having a diagnosis of mental illness, whether it be anxiety, depression, or so forth, would be that stigmatizing attribute. And although that's something that those of us sitting here know is really negative, has really horrible impacts, we actually know that stigma is very widely endorsed in Western culture. So a lot of individuals are adhering to those really negative stereotypical beliefs that we see surrounding mental illness. And unfortunately, a lot of this is caused by inaccurate portrayals or misinformation or just general lack of understanding about mental illness.
So just to talk a little bit about mental illness and some statistics behind mental illness and stigma, about 1 in 5 adults experience a mental illness in any given year. So this is about 47 million adults in the United States in a 1-year time period. And to put this into context, I'd like you to think about your friends and family members, those individuals close to you, and think about the number of individuals you have in your close circle. So I come from a family of 5, and I married into a family of 5. So my close, immediate family consists of 10 people. In the past year, what this indicates would be that at least 2 of those people that I love and I'm close to and I care about dearly probably experienced some kind of psychological distress within the last year. We also know that most people with a psychological disorder do not receive services. So about 58% of individuals with a mental illness never receive services. And this can be due to a variety of reasons, but we know that one barrier is those negative stereotypes, that discrimination they may experience, the fear of being judged because of their mental illness. About 49% of adolescents experience some kind of mental illness during that adolescent time period. So even as children and adolescents, this is really impactful. And Ashley's going to talk about self-stigma, how those negative attributions from the public are internalized, and how this really impacts individuals, but especially at that adolescent level when we're working on things like our self-image and self-esteem. 42% of Americans believe that individuals with a mental illness cannot be successful in their workplace. So a good number of Americans believe that other individuals, because of that mental illness, cannot be successful doing their job or their work duties. And if you think about 1 in 5 people have a mental illness in any given year, 20%, that's a large part of the workplace, but even a larger number of individuals that think that those people cannot be successful. And only 25% of Americans believe that individuals with a psychological disorder can experience recovery. So only 25% of people, not a large number of folks, believe that individuals with a psychological disorder can return to their previous level of functioning or can decrease the distress they experience because of their psychological disorder. So this is a quote. Corrigan and his colleagues are pretty prolific in the stigma research, and this is a powerful quote that we believe, discussing that the impact of stigma is just as harmful as the psychological disorder the individual experiences. So we know that psychological disorders cause dysfunction or distress in the individual's life. It impairs their ability to be successful in social relationships. It impairs their ability to be successful in school or work. But it also causes a lot of emotional pain, sometimes physical pain as well. So even though they experience that dysfunction due to the symptoms, the depression or anxiety, schizophrenia that they're experiencing, that stigma or discrimination they're experiencing is also pervasive and prevents them from getting the services that they need.
So Brooke did a really good job of outlining kind of like the big picture of stigma, so those negative implications that we see from it. Now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what some of those could be. Several pieces of literature describe mental health stigma as the most pervasive barrier to these individuals seeking treatment or getting help. Brooke and I are actually from the same small town, and there is one mental health facility located for all of the individuals in that community. So if you can picture yourself having this stigmatizing attribute, having that diagnosis, even having your car parked at that mental health facility or having individuals in your town know that you come from the family where people have mental illness can be really negative and have a really pervasive barrier to you seeking treatment or you even speaking out and saying, you know, I'm not doing really great, maybe I need to go get help. But this also kind of perpetuates that lack of understanding about mental health. So when we're not getting help for mental health, when we're not having medication readily available, when we're not getting treatment, that's when we start to see symptoms kind of become escalated. Those individuals are displaying that dysfunction, that distress, and that's where people kind of start to see that really severe lack of understanding about what mental illness actually is. And this kind of leads to that discrimination piece. So people with mental illness, as we know, are stigmatized, they're discriminated against in several different ways. One of the most important to be aware of is the impact that stigma of mental illness has on social opportunities. Specifically, individuals with a mental illness are over-criminalized compared to other populations. So right now we know that in America's jails and prisons, a majority of the population, both youth offenders and adults, are diagnosed with at least one mental illness, and that's not taking into account those individuals that maybe have a comorbid substance abuse disorder or some other mental illness. And that's kind of neglecting the abuse and trauma that may have been happening before that too. But we also know mental health stigma has a way of preventing individuals from finding housing or opportunities. So while we know that there are laws out there and there are things to protect these individuals, we also know that unfortunately it still happens that people with a mental illness struggle to find a job, they struggle to find housing, they struggle to maintain that job. One of the books that I've used in my thesis that's about mental illness, but also is just a really good read for everyone, is called Shunned, and it gives testimonials of different people that have experienced stigma and kind of their stories. One that I thought was really powerful was, I never admitted to my own depression. If I had, I would have never have stood a chance. So this right here kind of tells us that although these people with mental illness recognize that maybe they're struggling, they're not admitting to it and they're not getting help because they're worried about how that will impact them negatively. When we see these individuals being discriminated against or treated differently because of their mental illness in that public scenario, this also starts to trickle down into them having what we call self-stigma. So self-stigma is just that internalized feeling of stigma. Corrigan, again, one of the big researchers in this area, outlines this with the 3 A's of self-stigma. Those are awareness, acceptance, and application. So first, the individual becomes aware that the public is stigmatizing them, that those stereotypes exist. then they start to accept them about themselves. So the public is saying that I'm not very good at things, I can't do this, I won't be successful, so I start to accept that about myself, and then I start to apply it to my own life. And after we see that starting to happen, over time those individuals start to suffer with things like lowered self-esteem, lowered self-efficacy, and they start to have those hopeless feelings that what the general public is saying about me is actually true, right? There's no way I can find a job, I won't be successful, those types of things.
So throughout history, there has been a long line or a long demonstration of the really negative way that individuals with mental illness have been treated. So for centuries, mental illness was seen as being possessed by a devil, having some kind of punishment from God, and as a result of that, we saw some really inhumane treatment of individuals with mental illness. So things like exorcism, torture, prayers were used to try to beat or torture the mental illness or the demon out of the individual. And this really left society to believe that those individuals who were possessed were really a danger to society. Around the 16th to 19th century, we saw kind of a change in the way that individuals with mental illness were treated. So this idea of housing individuals with a psychological disorder in an institution where they could receive treatment really began to gain momentum around the 16th century. These institutions were called, does anybody know?
Asylums.
Right, asylums. So the idea behind them may have been good, but because of overcrowding, because they were dirty and kind of unkept, they really became like prisons, and the treatment that these individuals received was really dismal. So that's kind of really where this history of believing that individuals with mental illness were danger, that they posed some kind of threat to society, that's really kind of where that came from. Today, we see these myths about dangerousness really kind of perpetuated in the media. So as far as media portrayals, in primetime TV shows, 1 in 4 individuals with a mental illness are portrayed as being dangerous, they're portrayed as causing harm to another individual, or they even commit a murder. So really the media really does a really negative job of portraying individuals with psychological disorders as far as showing that they are dangerous or pose a threat to society. We also know that these depictions of individuals show that individuals with mental illness are unpredictable. They're more likely to show individuals with mental illness to be aggressive or violent, and they're also more likely to be depicted as being a criminal or a perpetrator of a crime. And we know from statistics that individuals with a mental illness in real life are much more likely to be a victim of a crime than to be a perpetuator of a crime. And because of these really kind of negative portrayals, the way that even journalism uses the words like crazy, lunatic, or flippantly uses mental illness, it perpetuates this idea that individuals with a mental illness should be feared or are dangerous.
So one of the ways that we know inaccurate portrayals of mental illness are brought about is through pop culture, through the media. Have any of you guys seen any of these movies up here? Yeah, so Silence of the Lambs is actually one of my favorite movies. However, how accurate do we think the depiction of Hannibal the cannibal is when addressing mental illness as a whole? Very inaccurate, right? While there are people out there that maybe do these really heinous acts, attributing all of them to mental illness just perpetuates that belief that because I have a mental illness, then I'm a violent killer. And then the general public thinks what? The same thing, right? People that have a mental illness, whether that be anxiety, depression, or so forth, commit these heinous acts. Have you guys seen the movie Split? Right, does anyone want to give kind of a rundown of what happens in that movie?
As long as nobody's afraid of spoilers, otherwise spoilers. But the guy in Split is suffering from like multiple personalities, is what the movie's based on, and each one is completely different from the other. And there's a hidden personality, the Beast, that 3 of his other personalities want to bring out because they kind of like worship it almost. And so they capture some cheerleaders and then they bring out the beast to basically tear them apart and eat them up and stuff. It's
Right.
really gruesome.
So
It's also part of a trilogy, along with Glass and something that Bruce Willis I think was in.
Unbreakable.
right, so we can see that that is a really dramatic portrayal of this disorder. But we also know that people that have alters, which would be those different personalities, having 20 some of them and one of them being a violent killer is shockingly inaccurate. I think the average for people that have something similar to that would be maybe 3, and they are not likely to be cheerleader capturing whatever that is. But there was a lot of testimonials after that movie of people that struggle with dissociation saying, this is just perpetuating stigma. You've made it harder for me to speak out about my mental illness. I was having enough problems as there was, and now there's a trilogy that 20-some people are, watching and talking about. And while this sells, right, I like these movies, I like going to the movie theater, talking about mental illness in an accurate way probably wouldn't make as much money, right? But this is what is being shown, this is what people are watching, and the people that aren't willing to come to things like this to learn why these portrayals are inaccurate are just carrying along those portrayals of mental illness. Now we have something with social media also talking about mental illness. So Brooke had kind of mentioned people flippantly talking about mental illness, but now we're starting to see this not only in media and TV, we're starting to see this on Twitter and Facebook through memes. This one here talks about me, time to get my life together and become a functioning adult, and then my depression saying no, right? So what does that lead us to believe? The individuals that struggle from depression aren't able to be successful adults, right? And while these are funny and while these are shared, these are again perpetuating that stigma of mental illness and showing the general public that because I have this diagnosis of depression, I'm not able to be a functioning adult. When we see this one here, it says when you realize your friend is psychotic. This again is perpetuating those beliefs that individuals that are psychotic can't, be successful, can't have a functioning job. But it's also saying that, you can be psychotic with a diagnosis, but also just because you have, a funny idea or you act differently during the day, that doesn't make you psychotic, right? That could be attributed to a diagnosis, but also people just act funny sometimes. That doesn't make you psychotic, right? Fortunately, there are some positive media influences that we're starting to see. So while there are negative portrayals of mental illness in memes, we are also starting to see some positive portrayals. Have you guys seen any of these My Therapist Says memes? I think they're hilarious. And one of the positive things about them is they're not typically talking about a certain mental illness. They're just kind of normalizing the experience of going to therapy. I think this one was made for me. What do we do when we're sad? Add to cart. Therapist. No. But I also like this one saying, oh, please tell me more about how people with depression should just cheer up, right? So that's normalizing the idea that I can't just cheer up, right? I'm struggling with this disorder, this is a medical condition, this is something I need to seek help for. I can't just cheer up and get better, right? Have you guys seen the movie Silver Linings Playbook? Mm-hmm. That movie is a little bit more of an accurate portrayal of mental illness. So no one in this movie is a violent killer. It kind of just describes their experience with treatment and getting socialization and different things like that. But overall, it's a much milder portrayal of what mental illness could mean for someone that's struggling with it.
Before we talk about decreasing stigma, I think you did a great job talking about media portrayals. Can you guys think of maybe some other movies or TV shows that you've watched that have portrayed mental illness, maybe in a positive way or a negative way?
Big Bang?
The Big Bang Theory. So what kinds of mental illness were portrayed in The Big Bang Theory?
Oh, I think there's a hodgepodge. Sheldon would be one, would be obsessive compulsive disorder, little egocentrism and neuroticism.
Yeah. So has anybody else watched The Big Bang Theory? It's pretty funny. If you haven't watched it, you should. So Sheldon would maybe be inaccurate or positive or negative. What do you think? Portrayal of OCD.
Probably both. I don't know. Probably more negative.
Yeah. So maybe a little bit negative. Maybe it kind of emphasizes the humor, I would say, in OCD, when really a lot of people with OCD experience a lot of distress, but also it might do a really good job discussing or looking at how those repetitive behaviors really are compulsive rather than just something they're wanting to engage in or optionally engaging in. That's a great example. Anyone think of some other examples of media portrayals?
A Beautiful Mind, Russell Crowe.
A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe. So what is portrayed in A Beautiful Mind?
He's a schizophrenic, but
Yes.
he's a genius.
Yeah, so the individual in A Beautiful Mind has schizophrenia. He's actually very smart and intelligent. Yeah. So what do you think? Accurate or inaccurate? Positive or
I mean, I'm
negative?
not a schizophrenic, so I don't know about accuracy.
What about positive or negative?
I think it's ambivalent.
Ambivalent?
It shows where it can go wrong untreated, but in the end, he's better when he recognizes it.
Right.
At the end, he has his whole discussion with his friend. You know, this is what happened, and sometimes I see him every now and then, but I know he's actually not there.
Right.
So you sort of follow his spiral down and then his recovery.
Yeah, so it does a nice job showing recovery, showing the importance and how accurate or how well recovery can actually occur. Yeah, that's a great example too. Did someone over here? Yes.
I just wonder your thoughts on, like, I don't know if you've seen The Mindhunter on Netflix.
Mindhunter on Netflix. That's a great question.
Every time they interview them, they always come up with a mental illness. So, does that show, like, a stigma to it?
So that's a great question. I personally I've only seen the first season, so I haven't seen the second season. I don't remember what diagnoses they assign in season 1, so I'll have to rewatch it. I personally have a problem with TV shows, right? Not for like entertainment value, but for educational value of serial killers or that show crimes, because that just goes to perpetuate that individuals with mental illness are dangerous. When we talk about individuals who are serial killers or have committed like mass shootings or things like that, a lot of times people will use the term sociopath or psychopath. Those actually aren't terms that we use clinically. They aren't diagnoses that we assign in clinical psychology. So those wouldn't count or wouldn't align with a mental illness. But that's a really great question. Have you seen Mindhunter?
I have not seen Mindhunter.
I'll watch it and then we can have a discussion on. Yeah. Has anyone else seen it? Yeah? What do you guys think about the diagnoses that are assigned?
It's very extreme examples.
Extreme examples?
Yeah, a lot of personality disorders.
Yeah, okay, great. Personality disorders. Did you have something to add, Rachel?
Yeah, so I mean, like, I don't know how exactly accurate it is for, like, a modern sense, because, like, the two, like, interviewers, like, they're, like, kind of, like, the founders of, like, forensic psychology, so, yeah, I don't know, like, if it's necessarily, like, what would be accurately portrayed today, and obviously there's, like, a lot of, drama that's added to it, but...
Great question. Good example. Yeah. Any other examples you guys can think of? Yes.
I was just going to mention Shameless, like there's multiple that are exemplified there with like bipolar disorder, and then also alcoholism is like to the extreme, and then maybe possibly like oppositional defiant disorder and impulsive disorder. Oh, and agoraphobia, yeah, I forgot about that.
So have you guys seen the TV show Shameless? This is a shameless plug. It's on Netflix right now, but also it airs on Showtime. But this very dysfunctional family. Several of the members of the family experience a psychological disorder, and definitely experience a lot of distress and dysfunction. So what do you think? A negative portrayal, positive?
I think a majority of them, it's like very extreme and does a more negative portrayal, in which, like, for example, with the bipolar 1 disorder, it's like they show him as a more violent person, or one that's really impulsive in dangerous acts, which can happen, but it's less likely. But with like the agoraphobia, the woman that has that, like that was really an eye-opening portrayal, and it does show like the severity of the distress and dysfunction that disorder can cause.
Right. So maybe some good, some positive, and some negative portrayals in there. Yeah. Those were all really great examples. I think I personally like talking about media and mental illness because there's lots and lots and lots of really good examples. It doesn't really make for great movies or great TV to show somebody who is suffering from mild or moderate depression, doesn't really do anything dangerous or outside of really what we would expect for those disorders, then goes to therapy and recovers and goes on to live a functional and normal life, right? There is some really interesting research on media and mental illness. So research has shown that the more time that individuals spend watching TV and movies, especially ones with inaccurate portrayals of psychological disorders, the more time they spend watching those TV shows, the less knowledge or less accurate knowledge they have on psychological disorders like schizophrenia and OCD. There's also some research that shows the more time individuals spend watching that kind of media, the more social distance they desire between individuals with those mental illnesses. So it really does impact the way that individuals in society view individuals with psychological disorders. Yeah. So in terms of decreasing stigma, I think the positive portrayals in the media and the positive portrayals in social media were a nice segue into this. We know that the more information that individuals have, right, the better their perception of individuals with psychological disorders are. One way is we can reduce those negative stereotypes or negative portrayals with accurate portrayals. We can engage in conversations about the negative portrayals and talk about what was inaccurate and maybe what they could have done to increase the accuracy or what kinds of things were dramatized. Providing correct information, willing to engage in discussions like we're having here, also is a way that we can work to decrease the stigma of mental illness. Avoiding labels and using respectful language. This is something that I am personally passionate about. There's kind of a drive in the field to use person-first language. Does anybody know what person-first language is? Yes?
A person with depression as opposed to a depressed person.
Right. It's a person with depression rather than a depressed person. So it's identifying and recognizing that a person is a person, they're an individual, and then that they are experiencing or suffering someone, rather than identifying them by their disorder. So using things like a person with depression, the man with autism, the woman suffering from bipolar disorder. So using words that don't necessarily define the individual by their disorder. Educational sessions have been shown to be very helpful. So even in as short periods as 30 minutes one time have shown to improve and increase the knowledge that individuals have about mental illness, and it has shown to decrease the negative perceptions that those individuals have. Educational sessions that are longer, like 6 to 8 weeks, or even a semester long, those of you who are in psychology classes, have been shown to also decrease stigma, increase knowledge, but also decrease the desire for social distance between individuals and those with mental illness. NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, and NMHA, the National Mental Health Association, both have really great programs and put out a lot of information and a lot of educational resources as far as having classes or offering workshops to increase knowledge, but also putting out information that you can search out, that you can share, that you can find.
So as Brooke just mentioned, one of the great ways to decrease stigma is just to increase education about mental illness. Brooke and I have kind of been on this kick lately that whenever we do a presentation on stigma or mental illness, we try to incorporate something educational at the end just to kind of decrease the stigma of mental illness. So what we'll talk about today is the dangerous piece of mental illness. So as we know in the media, that's what we see, that's what sells. But that's actually pretty misleading. We actually know that people that are diagnosed with a mental illness or struggling with mental health symptoms are more likely to be victims of a mental illness than to perpetrate a crime themselves. This was actually found in a study where they had a patient group and a control group, and almost half of that patient group, so those individuals that were diagnosed with a mental illness, had been victim of a crime, but the control group had only almost 15%. So we know those individuals that have a mental illness aren't actually often the ones committing those crimes. It's actually a small subgroup of those individuals, and that's the way that crime is typically committed as a whole. It's not individuals, every individual, it's a very small group of individuals committing the majority of the heinous crimes. And I think our clicker died. Okay. So what we wanted to kind of end off here was also just some additional mental health resources. So Brooke mentioned some really great educational outlets, but we also kind of wanted to reach out to you guys about resources if you know someone or you're struggling with a mental illness, but also just places to get additional information about mental health. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, has a website that has really great educational information, but also just has some suggestions for treatment or just additional information that might be helpful to you or to share with friends or family. High Plains Mental Health Center is the local mental health center in town. Community mental health, if you're struggling with a mental illness, you want to see a therapist, and you want to see someone off campus, that's a good outlet. Options Domestic and Sexual Violence Services is also another good outlet here in Hayes, and also the Kelly Center. This is one of the only places in your life you're going to be able to get free counseling services, and Fort Hayes is really great in the fact that it's not, you get 3 free services and then you have to start paying. Fort Hayes will give you free services till the end of your time, whether you're a student, you're faculty, you're a graduate assistant, and so forth. So you can walk in there, you can schedule an appointment anytime, and it's completely confidential and anonymous.
NAMI has a local chapter, NAMI Hayes. They put on educational sessions each month. They also have support groups for individuals who have a mental illness or for their family members. And then they also have support groups for individuals who have known someone who has died by suicide. We also have a NAMI on-campus group that continues that advocating work, but does it on campus. And if you guys want more information on how to join either of those organizations, I'd be happy to provide that to you. We wanted to say thank you to the American Democracy Project for having us, to the Forsyth Library for providing the space and the resources and also hosting, and also thank you to the Psychology Department. We also wanted to note that actually tomorrow is World Mental Health Day, so it is all of our duties now to go spread awareness about accurate portrayals of mental illness, but also accurate educational information about mental illness. And if you guys have any questions, we'd be happy to talk more about stigma, to talk about mental illness in general. We spoke quicker than we thought we would.
So you talked about at the beginning, or just a little bit ago, about replacing the negative stereotypes. I'm guessing you're talking about in movies primarily.
Yep.
How would you suppose we do that? And isn't that sort of a slippery slope sort of thing? Where what do we deem a negative stereotype? What stereotypes do we just say when we're talking about mental health? Or are we talking about the ditzy blonde, or any the valley girl, or the jock? I mean, where do we draw the line? And then how do you enforce that without infringing on freedom of speech, on artistic expression in movies, and so on and so forth?
So first off, I think that replacing negative stereotypes in regards to any kind of social group is important. So, right, you mentioned jocks or blondes, but even like racial stereotypes, things like that is very important to dispel. For the purpose of this, I'm just going to leave it to mental illness stereotypes. As far as like the media and movies, right, it's never going to be, like I said, as glamorous or dramatic or entertaining to go see a really truly accurate portrayal of some of those disorders. So as far as being able to shape those interests, I think that will be much more difficult. What we can do is be willing to call out inaccurate portrayals and be willing to have discussions. Something that I am very passionate about is when people misuse psychological terms, like the weather can never be bipolar because the weather is not a person. Also, bipolar disorder is a serious mental illness. It causes a lot of distress for individuals who experience it. And by using that term in a way that we apply it to weather, kind of really invalidates the experience of individuals with that disorder. So being willing to, one, maybe think about the language that we use, but also willing to educate those around us who use that language as well, in a nice, loving, kind way of saying, hey, Susan, I know that you had said you were angry one minute and you were really happy the next, and you felt like you were bipolar. Well, really, this is what bipolar disorder is, and this is why it's important to talk about it, but what you shared is kind of invalidating.
As a caveat, you went right into the language thing.
Yeah.
You brought up speaking in the man with
Yes,
depression
person
as opposed
first.
to, yeah.
Yeah.
So I am a manic bipolar. I got diagnosed when I retired from the military.
Thank you for sharing.
So, but I am, as far as I feel it, I am a bipolar. That is who I am, because it's not a negative thing. Now, saying man with means it's something that's sort of extra, there's something that's there that's not me.
That's a great point. So there is some research that shows that for a lot of people, owning that diagnosis or identifying with them is really empowering. So I would never say that you should not say that as how you identify or how you feel those things. Yeah.
Alright, so so in that case, that sort of part would be person specific at that point?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yeah. Great question.
And I
Do you have more to add?
I think mental health stigma is kind of, should be how we approach other social issues like Brooke mentioned. But for me, I try to think, what I want for myself is not necessarily what someone else wants. If that's what makes you feel empowered and that's what you prefer, then that's great. But maybe that's not what the person across the street, across the room prefers. So just being able to have that conversation like openly. How do you feel about this? How does this impact you? Does me calling you this empower you? If so, great, we'll do that. But if that hurts your feelings, then great, we're not gonna do that. But I think when I think about stereotypes of mental illness or stereotyping disorders, I think about physical disorders, right? Because there's this push that we treat mental illness like we treat, medical disorders. And I think when we start to think about, what I call a person with cancer, their medical condition, what I call a person with pneumonia by their medical condition. When we start to think about it that way, then I think that kind of sheds some light on maybe how we can address some of these things in a neutral way.
Any other questions?
That's a great question.
I don't know if I have a question, more just like a comment about the media thing.
Yeah.
I think this is also kind of a philosophical topic because when we think about, let's say in light of recent scandal with like Kevin Spacey, right? Always been a huge fan. But then you have to have this conversation about, well, what is the morality of supporting the work that he's done? And what does that say? Are you supporting, if you watch Big Bang Theory, the stigma of mental illness or whatever disease we're discussing? So I think just a comment that sometimes I think that can like broaden, this tragedy of the comments and what can you do as an individual by, not supporting these things that do feed into this.
Right. That ultimately could cause harm, right? Yeah, definitely. Yep, so choosing what we watch and watching things is spending dollars. We might not be spending it, we're giving our money to Netflix. But those shows are getting watched and they're getting money for those things, right? And thinking about how we are supporting them that way, that's a great comment. Thank you for adding that.
I think too, thinking about those as maybe opportunities for education can kind of be a positive spin. So I'm by no means telling you guys to stop watching movies, stop going with your friends to movie theaters, but I think, if you're there and you notice that morally this is a little bit left of what I typically align with, then after the movie, hey, what did you guys think? What I learned today was ... So kind of using those as times to inform, start a conversation, spread the education can kind of be a positive spin on something that would otherwise be pretty negative.
Any other thoughts? Well, thank you guys so much for having us today.
You guys going to the Fox? Is that a new restaurant?
Yes, we have been.
What do you think of it?
Good.